According to Islam, the Quran is infallible, that is, it is free from error. Moreover, Islam teaches Muhammad's sunnah, that is, his sayings and deeds in the hadith literature, are to be followed by Muslims. This presupposes they are accurate and thus worthy to be followed. For example, Muhammad said, "Keep to my sunnah." And there are many references in the Quran ordering Muslims to obey and emulate Muhammad's teaching and example. Thus, if there are historical, scientific, logical, and prophetic errors in the Quran and authentic hadith material, this proves Muhammad was a false prophet and that Islam is false.
The Quran is chock full of errors, whether logical or historical, scientific, mathematical. You name the category, the Quran probably has an error that would fit into it. An example of a logical contradiction appears when you compare, for example, a handful of verses in the Quran, such as Surah 2, verse 221, where we are told that Muslims cannot marry idolaters and unbelievers. If we compare that to Surah 5:5, where we're told that Muslim men can marry Christian women, we may infer from that Christian women are not idolaters and unbelievers. That is, if Muslims cannot marry idolaters and they can marry Christians, then Christians, as a matter of deductive certainty, can't be idolaters. However, according to Surah 9, verses 28 through 33, Christians are idolaters and unbelievers, so the Quran contradicts itself.
Muhammad believed the reason the sun appears to move in the sky is because of the sun's movement and not the earth's rotation. In Quran 36:38 we read, "And the sun runs his course for a period determined for him. That is the decree of him, the exalted in might, the all-knowing." Unquote. In the hadith literature, Muhammad explains this verse, leaving no doubt this is what he believed. In Sahih Bukhari we read, narrated Abu Dar, "The Prophet asked me at sunset, 'Do you know where the sun goes at the time of sunset?' I replied, 'Allah and his apostle know better.' He said, 'It goes, i.e. travels, till it prostrates itself underneath the throne, and takes the permission to rise again. And it is permitted, and then a time will come when it will be about to prostrate itself, but its prostration will not be accepted, and it will ask permission to go on its course, but will not be permitted. But it will be ordered to return whence it has come, and so it will rise in the west.' And that is the interpretation of the statement of Allah, and the sun runs its fixed course for a term decreed. Hence it is clear Muhammad believed the reason it looks like the sun is moving in the sky is because of its movement and not the earth's rotation around the sun, as science proves. This is a clear scientific error in the Quran and Ahadith. As the following modern science book confirms, the real reason behind the apparent motion of the sun through the daytime sky is the rotation of the earth. The earth orbits the sun." Unquote.
بالنسبة إلها هي اللي تدور حول الأرض لأنها هي الأصغر من الأرض بموجب الآيات القرآنية.
One of the most popular Muslim arguments is the scientific accuracy of the Quran. The claim here is that Muhammad revealed things that couldn't have been known during his time, and this is just nonsense. The Quran is a scientific catastrophe. Chapter 1886 of the Quran says that the sun sets in a muddy pool. 86, 6 through 7 say that semen is formed between the backbone and the ribs. 88:20 says that the earth is flat. 65:12 says that there are 7 earths. 22:65 says that the sky would fall on the earth if Allah didn't hold it up. 37:6 through 10 and 67:5 declare that stars are missiles that God uses to shoot demons who try to sneak into heaven. And Muslims look at all of this and then they tell us that the Quran is known to be true because of the scientific miracles in it. And I just want to know, what did Muhammad say that an average person walking around wouldn't have known? Everything else beyond that he got wrong. He got everything that he could possibly get wrong. He got wrong.
Muhammad taught Alexander the Great was a righteous Muslim who believed in and obeyed Allah. In Surah 18 of the Quran, Dhul Qarnayn, which means 2 horns, is said to be a man who had Allah's support, was holy and righteous, and believed in and worked with and obeyed Allah. There is much evidence the author of the Quran viewed this dual Qur'an as Alexander the Great. First, many of Islam's greatest commentators of the Quran affirm these verses are about Alexander the Great. Second, on ancient coins there are drawings of Alexander the Great with 2 horns on his head, which is significant since, again, dual Qur'an means 2 horns. Third, Arabs like Al-Asha, who was a poet living shortly prior to Muhammad, and Hassan ibn Thabit, who was contemporary with Muhammad, called Alexander the Great dual Qur'an. Thus, the expert on Alexander the Great, Richard Stoneman, affirms, quote, "The 2 names, Alexander the Great and dual Qur'an, were already synonymous when Muhammad came to compose this surah of the Quran." In fact, modern scholars have shown the Quranic story of this dual Qur'an in Surah 18 actually comes from the pre-Islamic mythical Syriac source called A Christian Legend Concerning Alexander, translated into English by Sir Ernest Alfred Wallace Budge in 1889. When one compares the Quranic story in Surah 18 to the Syriac tale of Alexander the Great side by side, there is no question this is where the Quran got the Alexander fable. There are more than 11 similar features between the 2 stories, such as Alexander having 2 horns, being given power, the sun rising on the people with no cover, punishment of the unrighteous, Gog and Magog spoiling the land, and the building of a wall as a defense. As Stoneman notes, quote, "The commentators on the Quran universally assumed that dual Qur'an here in Surah 18 is the name of Alexander. Their assumption was clearly correct, since the 2 stories here in Surah 18 associated with dual Qur'an are precisely those 2 stories associated with Alexander in the Syriac legend of Alexander, current shortly before the composition of the Quran. This proves unequivocally the Quran is not of divine origin, but instead stole earlier uninspired mythical stories or legends. Moreover, Surah 18 also proves the Quran is historically inaccurate for claiming Alexander the Great was a righteous man who believed in and obeyed Allah. For the historical evidence concerning Alexander the Great shows he was actually an unrighteous polytheistic pagan. The 2 earliest extant and most reliable biographies of Alexander the Great were written by Arrian and Plutarch. According to Arrian, quote, "Alexander offered sacrifice on the following day to the gods who had revealed the signs and assured him," unquote. Similarly, Plutarch relayed, quote, "The empire of the Persians was thought to be utterly dissolved, and Alexander, proclaimed king of Asia, made magnificent sacrifices to the gods," unquote. Arrian also reported, quote, "I pity Alexander for his mishap, because on that occasion he showed himself the slave of 2 vices, anger and drunkenness," unquote. Finally, Plutarch relayed Alexander engaged in drunken homosexual acts, quote, "He, Alexander, was once viewing some contests in singing and dancing, being well heated with wine, and that his favorite, Bagoas, won the prize for song and dance, and then, all in his festal array, passed through the theater and took his seat by Alexander's side, at sight of which the Macedonians clapped their hands and loudly bade the king kiss the victor, until at last he threw his arms about him and kissed him tenderly," unquote.
An example of a scientific error in the Quran can be found in Surah 596. According to that passage, Muslims can eat anything that swims in the seas or the oceans, the waters, and this is in contrast to other foods that Allah has forbidden. However, if this verse is true, then it would be okay, there'd be no problem in eating things like stonefish, pufferfish or blowfish, a triggerfish, poison dart frog, barracuda, a marble cone snail. All of these things are poisonous for human beings, and yet Allah says, eat up. That's a very clear scientific error.
The Quran claims mountains were placed down onto earth as pegs. Quran 31:10 says, quote, "He has created the heavens without any pillars that you can see, and he has placed in the earth firm mountains that it may not quake with you," unquote. Quran 78:6-7 also says, "Have we not made the earth as a bed, and the mountains as pegs?" unquote. Daryabadi translates the last Arabic word as stakes. These texts teach the way mountains appeared was that God placed them down onto earth from the sky, like pegs or stakes. The scientific problem is mountains are actually formed by tectonic plates colliding together. As we read in the science book Physical Geography, quote, "The world's highest mountains, the Himalayas, were formed when the Indian plate collided with the Eurasia. The Alps were formed in a similar manner in a collision between the African and Eurasian plates," unquote. Muhammad taught the traits of children are determined by which parent climaxes first during sexual intercourse. Muhammad said, quote, "As for the resemblance of the child to its parents, if a man has sexual intercourse with his wife and gets discharged first, the child will resemble the father, and if the woman gets discharged first, the child will resemble her," unquote. This is a serious scientific error, proving Muhammad was a false prophet. A child's traits are determined by genes inherited by the mother and the father, and it has nothing to do with who climaxes first during sexual intercourse. As one modern science textbook on heredity points out, quote, "Every person has 2 copies of most genes in their genome. One copy of the gene comes from their mother, and the other one comes from their father. The 2 copies of the genes are not exactly the same. They contain small changes in the sequence of DNA bases. These 2 different versions of the same gene are called alleles. The small differences in the alleles cause offspring to resemble their parents without looking exactly the same as either parent."
An example of a mathematical error in the Quran arises from Surah 4, verses 11 through 12, where we're given the inheritance law in Islam. And so if you read that passage, the way it works out is, for example, if a person left a wife, 2 daughters, a father and a mother behind, then the wife would get 1/8 of the inheritance, the daughters would get 2/3, the father would get 1/6, and the mother would get 1/6. And if you do the math, it comes out to, I think it's 27/24, which of course doesn't jive. That is, they're due to inherit more than the person actually has.
The Quran falsely teaches the New Testament Virgin Mary was the sister of the Old Testament figure Aaron, and that she was the daughter of Imran, who was Aaron's father. The reason the Quran made this serious mistake was because Aaron's sister was also called Mary, just like Jesus' mother was, and Muhammad therefore confused the 2. This historical error shows the Quran is not inspired by God. Muslims offer different unconvincing responses to this, but the Muslim scholar Muhammad Assad claims the Quran only referred to Mary's ancestral relationship to Aaron when it called her the sister of Aaron. However, this response won't work because Quran 3:35-38 explicitly says, "The wife of Imran, i.e. Aaron's mother, literally gave birth to Mary, the mother of Jesus." In Quran 1886, which, as we noted, concerns Alexander the Great, we read, quote, "Until when he reached the setting of the sun, he found it set in a spring of murky water. Near it he found a people," unquote. This is clearly a scientific error since the sun does not and is not small enough to set in a spring of water. In response, Islamic commentator Maulana Daryabadi argues the Arabic word for found here, wajada, should be taken in a subjective sense, meaning he perceived it setting in water, even though Daryabadi admits the word can have an objective meaning corresponding to fact, i.e. he found it setting in water. However, Daryabadi is mistaken because right after this verse says Alexander found the sun setting in water, it then continues and says he also found a people, using the same Arabic word for found, wajada. Thus, according to the Quran, the same way Alexander literally found a people, he literally found the sun setting in water. And lastly, in a sound hadith in Sunan Abu Dawud, Muhammad said the sun literally sets in water, not that it's only perceived to do such. Quote, narrated Abu Dar, "I was sitting behind the Messenger of Allah who was riding a donkey while the sun was setting. He asked, 'Do you know where the sun sets?' I replied, 'Allah and his apostle know best.' He said, 'It sets in a spring of warm water,'" unquote. The Quran is full of other logical errors or contradictions. For example, did creation take Allah 8 days as Quran 41:9-12 clearly shows? or 6 days, as Quran 25:59 clearly says? Is it possible for Muslims to treat their 4 wives justly, ta'dilu, as Quran 4:3 indicates? Or is it not possible to treat them justly, ta'dilu, as Quran 4:129 indicates? It depends on what verse you read. Will the food for people in hell be from a tree with fruit stalks like the heads of devils, as Quran 37:62-66 says? Or will it only be foul pus, as Quran 69:36 says? Or will it only be bitter dari, as Quran 88:6 says? Will there be no questioning and inquiry of earthly acquaintances on that day, i.e. the day of judgment, as Quran 23:99-101 clearly says? Or will such questioning and inquiry indeed take place on that day, as Quran 37:26-28 clearly says? Did Allah create the earth first and then the heavens second, as Quran 2:29 says? Or did he create the heavens first and then the earth second, as Quran 79:27-32 says? Because Muhammad was a false prophet, he made many false prophecies. Deuteronomy 18:22 says, "When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass, or come true, that is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You need not be afraid of him," unquote. In Quran 32-4, Muhammad taught the Byzantines would defeat the Persians within 3 to 9 years, after the Persians first defeated them. It says, "The Byzantines have been defeated in the nearest land, but they, after their defeat, will overcome, within 3 to 9 years," unquote. That the Arabic phrase, fi biddi sina, does indeed refer to 3 to 9 years is evidenced by many sources. As quoted, the Sahih International Translation of the Quran renders the phrase as 3 to 9 years, as do the Mushin Khan and Pickthall translations. Moreover, Abdul Manan Omar's Dictionary of the Holy Quran affirms the word means, quote, few, range between 3 and 9. Also, the Islamic scholar Allama Usmani confirms, in lexicon and in the tradition, the word biddi is applied to a period ranging from 3 to 9 years, unquote. Moreover, Yusuf Ali also confirms, quote, bid in the text means a short period, a period from 3 to 9 years, unquote. So there's no question. However, the first battle Muhammad talked about was in AD 614, when the Persians shockingly conquered Jerusalem and defeated the Byzantines, who were led by Emperor Heraclius. Then the Byzantines did defeat the Persians afterwards, but it was 13 years later in AD 627 at Nineveh, not 3 to 9 years later, as Muhammad falsely prophesied. This is a major false prophecy proving Muhammad was a false prophet. Next, in Quran 3, 150-151, Muhammad predicted the Muslims would be victorious in the Battle of Uhud, with the Meccan pagans, quote, nay, God is your protector, and he is the best of helpers. Soon shall we cast terror into the hearts of the unbelievers, for that they joined companions with God, for which he had sent no authority. Their abode will be the fire, and evil is the home of the wrongdoers, unquote. So according to Muhammad, God would protect the Muslims in this battle, terror would be cast into the hearts of the opposing army, and the abode of the opposing army would be hell. This indicates the Muslims would win the battle. Indeed, the commentator Ibn Abbas explained this was a prophecy of triumph regarding the Battle of Uhud. However, the Muslims went on to lose this battle in a devastating fashion, as Muslim scholar Ibn Kathir affirmed, quote, as Sudi said, when the disbelievers attacked Muslim lines during the Battle of Uhud and defeated them, some Muslims ran away to al-Madinah, unquote. This is a major false prophecy. Now, in Sahih Muslim, Muhammad falsely predicted the last hour would happen during the lifetime of a young boy who was present with him, quote, Anas reported a person asked Allah's messenger as to when the last hour would come. He had in his presence a young boy of the Ansar who was called Muhammad. Allah's messenger said, if this young boy lives, he may not grow very old till he would see the last hour coming to you, unquote. Moreover, Muhammad predicted the end of the world would happen very shortly after his life, quote, Anas reported Allah's messenger as saying, I and the last hour have been sent like this, and, while doing it, joined the forefinger and the middle finger. Muhammad said this about 1400 years ago, which is clearly incorrect. Also, Muhammad predicted, quote, the last hour would come when the Romans would form a majority amongst people, unquote. However, the largest people group in the world is by far the Han Chinese, who have over a 1.2 billion person population. Thus, Muhammad was wrong, since the Han Chinese far supersede any ethnic group, including Romans, in terms of population number and growth.